Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. I'm your host, Will Button. Joining me back, repeat performer, Tom Brady. Dang, I was going somewhere with that and I totally screwed that up.
I'll take it, Tom Brady, yeah.
Right. Luca, repeat guest, welcome. Luca is the, to introduce everyone, Luca is the VP of product over at Humanitec,
yeah.
Yeah, and the face behind the magic of PlatformCon, coming back to talk to us this time about MVP, minimum viable platforms, and having a chat here with my great co-host Warren. Warren, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, well, thanks, Will. I'm Warren. I'm CTO authorist. And you know what? I actually have something really important I want to share with you, Will.
Bring it on.
Yeah, I decided that during this introduction, I'm going to share a really cool fact if I have one.
All right. Let's hear it.
Oh, no, there's not one for you.
But if there ever is one, this is the time when you're going to drop it.
You got it.
Right.
Just carved out the space for the next time.
Yeah, for sure.
Nice. Build in the suspense for the next episode. Way to keep them hooked. But Luca, welcome. Welcome back to the show. So you are probably like super busy right now because PlatformCon is coming up soon, right?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back. You know, we're starting to ramp up the whole PlatformCon thing for sure. There's also a few other things that we are working on on the community front. We are working on the first course actually that we're going to release. So first time I say that, so that's a bit of news, and we're looking to launch that in the next month, 2 months latest, before PlatformCon. So that's a lot of work, and yeah, just came off a week in Paris at KubeCon. It was pretty intense as well.
So when you say you're launching a course, is that like a course on how to build an internal developer platform?
Yeah, so we're kind of like breaking that into different modules, and the first module is going to be platform engineering fundamentals. Really? So that's where we're and I can actually, I think I have a page I can link for you as well, where people can go and like basically join the wait list that's already live. But yeah, so it's going to be all live, all Zoom based, nothing recorded, and it's going to be 10 weeks cohort based. A bit of a test that we're doing, but there seems to be a decent amount of demand already, and so yeah, we're testing it out. So that's really just the fundamentals, and it kind of culminates with the MVP, with the minimum viable platform that we're going to talk about. And then sort of the next module would be MVP to IDP, and kind of going more to the full on rollout. So yeah, that's how we structured it so far. But you know, lots of ideas and other things that we could add later as well. It's actually, I feel like most of the work is actually like cutting out stuff, you know, because like we first started, it was just like this like massive pile of ideas, and then we're just being like cutting out. And I think right. The first like 10 weeks now is it's pretty crisp. It's nice.
Right on. Cool. So yeah, the topic we were going to cover today is the MVP. And I first saw this, I think it was a couple weeks ago. You mentioned it in the newsletter that you send out, and it kind of really hit me like really strongly, because it's something I've been guilty of doing many, many times, where you decide that you've got to build this platform tool to support your engineering teams, and you end up with this huge year-long project, you know, and your MVP approach is like, no, just take 4 weeks and just get something that works and then iterate on it, which is what we do in the startup world all the time. But for whatever reason, you know, whenever it comes to building our own internal tools, we've failed to take that approach. So tell us a little bit about the MVP approach for platform engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exactly like what you said, right? I feel like we've been kind of like talking about, platform as a product for a long time. And, every time you have this conversation, everybody nods and is, and it makes sense, right? The thing though is like, and, and so there's different, I think there's like different dimension of that. One is obviously, and I think that the thing that we've been harping on for the longest time of like building this, and we spoke about it the last time, Will, but like of building this like really tight feedback loop between the platform team and your application developers, right? To really understand, okay, what is the right level of context? What is the right level of abstraction that I want to provide them? And so on and so forth. And that's really important, right? But one of the other kind of like best practices of product management is this idea of an MVP, and that you really want to move fast at the beginning and iterate quickly, because as you said, right, like I think I've seen now maybe hundreds of platform engineering initiatives in the enterprise, and it's quite sad. I think one of the main patterns that you see is people getting really excited about platform engineering and like, hey, this is how I'm going to fix all these problems, blah, blah, blah. And then they're just like, the initiative dies before it even gets started, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is, not only you need to kind of have this like platform as a product mindset, right? But also you need to be like a really strong communicator and a really and a really good seller, right? Like at the end of the day, you can think literally of your platform as a product within the context of your own organization that is effectively your TAM, right? Like your total addressable market. And the way you go to market is, you start small and you find your first set of customers and you iterate from there. And so the same thing is true. And the problem is, and we've noticed this last year, we've released this like reference architectures that have been, I think, a game changer in terms of just like provide the same level for the conversation for people to just like, hey, this is what the blueprint of an enterprise grade internal developer platform looks like, and this is, these are different pieces, and at least provide like a common lingo for people to discuss things. But I think one of the mistakes that I've seen teams do is then like take that and be like, all right, like I want to roll out the whole thing immediately, right? And like, it's gonna have the security plan, it's gonna have this, and blah 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 blah, and that's kind of the issue, right? Like that you basically just if you think about like all the stakeholders that you need to get on board with something like this, it can vary, but it's usually a combination of your application developers, of your operations teams, of your current infra teams, of your architects, your managers, and the whole management suite. And so like to try and like get everybody bought in at the same time, it's so hard because there's so many people involved, and you start speaking with person A and B, C, D, and by the time you get to person Z, which is the last one that you need to convince, person A, it's been 6 months and person A completely forgot about you, right?
Yeah.
And then it's just like you get stuck.
Yeah, and another layer to that, I think, is the more people you talk with, everyone adds requirements onto what the deliverable should be. So by the time you go from person A to person Z, you've added, at least 26 different requirements that you didn't have in the beginning, which again further delays how long it takes to get this thing rolled out.
I think it's a trickle down problem, maybe. Like I feel like often it's a redesign of existing tools, and maybe the orchestrator of that, or the effective stakeholder that's the official owner of, or official champion, who starts out on that project, doesn't really understand all of those key aspects that are being supported today. And so like, I feel like from experience, there's always been this challenge really to not just parity feature every single thing that existed. And I feel like in the current market, if you were going with, like, if you have a startup and you're going to release a product, you know who you're going after, and you don't care that it mimics one-to-one the number one competitor in the space or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
I feel like that may be something that's definitely lost, to understand that you don't have to solve every use case when you build something up.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's another key point there, is that treating it like a product, because the engineering teams that we support are our customers. And one of the things that's often lost, I think, is understanding that those customers do have a choice in the tools that they use. They don't have to use our product. That's how I actually got my introduction to AWS in, like, I think it was like 2008 or so. We were in the middle of an outage working on it, and slowly started to realize that the servers that were down weren't actually in our data center, that they were being hosted in this place called AWS somewhere, because our system was so cumbersome and painful to use. The engineering teams were just introduced to AWS, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. We're done with the data center model.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that's, we're basically just noticed this pattern over and over again of just all this increasingly large cemetery of platform engineering initiatives that just would get stuck in their tracks before even get going. And so we kind of try to basically just observe, what do successful platform engineering teams do, and also in our own deployments of Humanitec as the platform orchestrator, as part of the enterprise grade IDP, what were the ones that were able to move fast and improve value effectively. And that's been, and so then we've kind of condensed that into this framework that we use. And we spoke sort of in a how do you say, I guess, inflammatory way. Anyways, we usually do that, whether it's DevOps is that. Now we had the kind of platform engineering dies in 4 weeks and everybody's freaking out. But the bottom line, and the reason is because in 4 weeks you can actually completely lose the momentum instead of doing something like an MVP. Now, I will say I think 4 weeks is potentially on the lower end and quite optimistic. But I've seen Fortune 500 companies roll out minimum viable platform in 6 to 8 weeks. And that's all you need, because the important thing is that at the end of that process, you're able to prove value to some key stakeholders that you've identified at the beginning, right? And again, it doesn't need to be all of them. It can also be that just management and app devs are enough, and you can worry about security and architects later down the line, right? Right. But at least you get that initial buy-in from really the important ones. For you, might be that for someone else, security is the most important stakeholder. And then you keep that momentum and you iterate from there. And I think momentum is really the most important thing that you don't want to lose when you're trying to roll something out across, thousands of developers in some cases. And that is potentially radically changing the way that people are used to do things or even think about things.
Yeah, for sure. If they're in some cases where they're coming from an organization where it takes weeks to months to launch a product, to introduce them to this type of rapid deployment cycle where you're actually talking about minutes, it's a complete mind-blowing experience. It takes time for them to understand that this is actually okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point, right? I think maybe it's unfair in some situations. In order to be successful with a platform, you need to do these things correctly. And a lot of organizations don't have that as a strategy for rolling out software or their features in their actual products even. So getting that mindset to transfer, I can imagine you're maybe even doomed from the start.
Yeah, that's a that's a really good point. And I think some are actually.
Oh no. How
I,
does it,
yeah.
yeah, how do you succeed in those companies where, you may need to pioneer product management or, business analytics for the features or feature set services that you're building?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's again as a conversation around start small. You don't need to change your entire org. So what we have seen works really well is this idea of what we call a pioneering team,
Yeah.
lighthouse, whatever. And so this is usually so in the context again of a platform rollout, this is the team that will normally have been the first ones to, I don't know, adopt Kubernetes or Terraform. Like they're not afraid of change. In fact, they like that. They embrace it. They want to try new things.
We're
And
innovators.
potentially, exactly, and potentially have the, also kind of, the pain points, right, that you're trying to solve, right? Because it's like, hey, maybe I am like a team of like senior backends that ends up doing what we call shadow operations all the time because effectively I need to support other people because I'm the most knowledgeable about this specific like Helm chart or whatever. And so, it's a real thing for me because I don't know, 20% of my day is spent on that instead of developing new features. And so this platform can really save me that time, right? And so when you have that combination of early adopters and sort of like pain point, that's really like the sweet spot. And then the other thing for me is metrics. Like what do you measure this against? And I think it's very interesting because obviously there are, and this is something that I've been thinking about, and we're writing a piece on it, which is like, what are your kind of like MVP, IDP metrics to look at? Because certainly, I mean, I'm a big fan of Dora, and I hate, like I don't want to like reinvent the wheel or anything. But it is true that like, Dora is great in theory. Then in practice, like every time I speak to people, it's like, oh yeah, we do Dora, but it's like you don't really do Dora. Like you're actually measuring it in practice, right? And so the problem is that then you roll out this platform, but then how do you like what is the show value bit, right? When you don't have a clear benchmark as a baseline, right? And so you could actually go do Dora for that, which I think is totally fine. The issue is I think like Dora is great as a like a as something that really scales, but you don't necessarily need that to prove that something has worked in like 4 or 6 weeks, right? You might, right? And so I think there the conversation is to get a lot more sort of like qualitative potentially, but also quantitative. But it's more about like again taking this like MVP approach even to the metrics, right? And say, okay, what is something that will not necessarily like scale to like measuring the success of the platform to 2,000 developers, but will prove valuable, to like measure something in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And a lot of times it's actually going ask, for instance, if we stick to the example of this like senior backend, is like, hey, how many how often are you slacked by somebody to ask you something, or how many I don't know, like scripts does somebody need to touch in order to deploy something? And it's like 5 scripts. Great, we're going to bring that down to 1, right? Like it's very, very simple where you can just like pick this like 2-3 key metrics that you care about, and then you do the MVP thing. And by the way, like what we mean really by MVP is basically a platform that is capable of kind of like handling a representative application, right? That is connected to your infrastructure, that is connected to your real resources and everything, is not production ready, right? But is good enough for developers to play around with it, for architects to see how it connects with everything and how it consumes resources and yada, yada, yada. And so when you have that, at the end of that, you can show, okay, well, actually now my developers, can use the platform orchestrator or whatever to deploy something, in one click, or just touching one script, just using Score as the kind of like open source of interface or whatever. And, and that's the measurable improvement that you have over the baseline. And I think that's really, really important. So yeah, start small and take it from there.
You said something really interesting, and I really want to hone in on that. You don't need to use Dora necessarily, because I think you're absolutely right. And the example of how many support tickets do you get is a great proxy metric for dealing with that. And I think a lot of people aren't even tracking because they're using Slack potentially, and it's difficult to know, like, did you even solve those particular issues? So even measuring before you get there helps to justify whether to go forward. I think the only metric I've ever seen here that is definitely the wrong one is adoption. Because you don't know why they're adopting it, right? You don't necessarily know whether or not it's actually helping them. It could be driven through politics, right? Like, you can go and pay people more money, or say that they have to do it, have some OKR that says everyone has to adopt the platform engineering team's new platform, and then you'll get adoption, whether or not it's actually a positive impact for the business.
100%. Exactly. And I've seen that many, many times, right? Where you just like, instead of aligning people, you completely misaligned incentives.
Right.
And especially in large organizations where you have so many, like this doesn't happen when let's say you're like 300-400 developers and the platform teams up, but when you have like thousands of developers and maybe even competing platform team initiatives, which by the way, I think is a very interesting conversation that I had a couple of times last week at KubeCon, where people are like, do you think there should be competing initiatives, right? And like, I think at a certain scale, we've worked closely with Aaron Erickson, who built the platform at Salesforce a few years ago, and he was telling me that there were like 2 or 3 like competing initiatives. And again, because the market, the TAM was so large, like they actually created the right set of incentives, right? At least at the beginning. But yeah, then you gotta wonder, like, it's all about, again, like how smart your measurement is of success. Because if it's just like adoption for adoption's sake, then yeah, you totally end up in a situation where there's like some VP that is just like bonusing on some adoption metric, and the entire team is going to drive towards that.
Yeah, no, there's a great corollary there too. Like, there are some companies out there that absolutely live by there can only ever be one of this thing in our whole company. And even on the product side, like if I look at AWS, there are products that do a very similar thing that are both AWS services that you can use either one of them. There's so many of them that they have competing names, and you often aren't sure which one to use. But then there are other cloud providers and other products out there where there is only one of each one, and none of them are very good. I think you're absolutely right? You look at how many users are there, how many people are approaching that, and maybe they have slightly different needs, or maybe they don't, and it doesn't matter. You can share the market, like everyone can have a cell phone.
Is good. Absolutely. And I don't really know what the right answer is, right? Like, I think it highly depends. Like, I think in some cases it makes sense. At what point does the competition actually create, again, some like weird incentives that are actually like against the sort of like overall well-being of the company? I think
perverse incentives can always be there. I always look back to evolution, like a biological evolution, to tell us things, because I think there's really interesting conclusions there. Like, there are birds with different beaks, right? It's like, well, why are there that like that? They're like, there only never needs to be one, right? That lives in one particular location, or there's only one bird in the whole world of this type, and then there's a different one kind of insect and one kind of plant. I mean, that's just ridiculous when I say it, right? So 6 billion years tells us that maybe the conclusion is that difference is okay.
Yeah.
So now we've got the Darwin's theory of evolution applied to platform engineering.
Love that.
Well, actually, it's really interesting because I read a paper a while back ago that compared the Linux operating system modules to, I think it was C. elegans or Stranded E. coli. And you can see, and because it's small enough to be able to see that there's duplication in what's going on, and we understand how the proteins work in the creature. And you can actually see that there are duplications in things. Like there are duplications of this and duplications of that. If one of these pieces of DNA is broken or mutated, the creature can still live and survive. Whereas it's completely inverted in a lot of the software we build today. If one little component is broken, then the whole platform falls apart.
Oh, good point. Yeah. So when it comes to the MVP, you touched on this on the one of the blog posts on your website. You broke it down into like 4 different stages. So walk us through those stages of building an MVP for platform engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so it's quite simple, right? Like the first one, we really talk about it a lot, and it's kind of like the design phase, right? So what you really want to get to, and if I think about it from a kind of like also Humanitec perspective, it's really where we go in and really spend time with the teams and try to understand, okay, what's the baseline? What are we trying to measure success against? And what do you want? Scoping out really what this kind of like minimum viable application, right? That is what we're going to deploy. Looks like, and what are all the different resources and dependencies and so on. And it's quite interesting there as well, because I think a lot of the time again is about trimming, because people will tell you, oh, like the minimum viable thing is like all these things, and it's like, really, is it? Like, and you're just like basically then spend like an hour just like, do you really need like another database or like blah blah, and then like you cut it out, you keep it quite simple, because really again, you don't need like all these things, right? To prove value. And I think a lot of times teams are just stuck in this vicious circle of, oh, I'm used to having like 400 different resource definitions for each RDS instance, which is exactly the problem that you're trying to solve by rolling out a platform. But then, in the MVP, I'm still going to have like 4, because why not? And it's kind of like that mindset. It's quite hard to like get out of, I think, if you're just so used to have like 400, you think like 4 is is nothing, right? But it's like, well, you still just have 1. So that's kind of like the design phase, right? It's the first one, and then the second one is really the second and third phase is really, well, it's kind of like the technical build out bit, right? So the first one is really like kind of like architecture and speaking to people and everything. The second is you actually get going, right? You integrate with all the different bits and pieces and resources, infrastructure that are needed, and then you deploy your app. That's the third one, is deploying the minimum viable platform with the application, its dependencies, and so on. And then the fourth phase, it's demo time, right? That's, I think, where really rubber meets the road. And it's like, okay, have you done your homework? And everything comes into to fruition, right? It's like, have you established the right metrics at the beginning, and what is the measurable improvement over those? And is the application going and everything? The interesting bit again is, almost like virtually no platform initiative fails because of technical reasons, right? Like at the end of the day, you always end up like you always solve something, especially when the problem is like, I have 400 RDS instances or whatever, or my developers take like a week to request something. There's like the room for improvement. And this is like the average like large enterprise. That's the reality set. So the room for improvement, technically, it's there. The question again is like, okay, how do you show that you've actually improved, right? And can you sell it internally? And do you have a clear plan to go after that from there, right? And so that's why I think really the technical build out is great, but it's something that, I mean, especially like at Humanitec, for instance, we've now done it like tens of times in large deployments. It's like it's really like rinse and repeat. What changes every time is like, okay, what are the key metrics? And again, there are similarities there, which is why I want to put it out as a blog post soon, because they're starting to like emerge patterns that I think can be useful for everybody to use effectively. But like the part that is a little bit more bespoke is like, okay, what are the metrics? And then effectively, okay, who do you demo it to, and how do you speak to them, and and how do you get that, again, supported internal buy-in to go from there. But yeah, so design, integrate, deploy, and demo.
How we keep on saying minimal viable product for platforms or minimum viable platform. Like how small can we get? When I think about some products out there, they're just a vaporware. Like there's a website with a sign up button, which then redirects to a contact form that you enter your email, right? And we know that doesn't really give you the real feedback you need, but that's like I did almost nothing.
Right.
I mean, I recently ran an MVP test for a prototype where I literally wrote a Notion page and I just shared that. It's sort of like an Amazon 6-pager, and was like, would you buy this thing? Is that like, can we go that small, or is there some magic line that you would say where you still need to do something to show, and you should release that, but like going much further is probably a mistake, and not going to that point is also not going to lead you in the right direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I would say there's some pretty real work that you still do in the MVP. Like you're still, integrating things, building things, and you also got to be careful, I think, because one of the sort of traps that I've seen a lot of times platform teams fall into is this kind of like this visualization anti-pattern, right? Which is basically like, okay, like I'm building a platform, and even if you approach it with this like MVP mentality, right? Then it's like, okay, like I'm just gonna, the platform is just like this like layer, basically, as you said, this like this UI, this front end. And I'm gonna get like a nice dashboard at the end. And the problem is like with that, that's exactly, it's kind of like the same as like the sort of like adoption for adoption's sake incentive. Like you're just building something for the sake of it. You're not actually like solving the problems. And so, and again, like if I go back to like Aaron Erickson, like he had like 2 quotes, I think they were really cool from his like Salesforce days. One was like, if you have 1,000 developers, you shouldn't have 1,000 Kubernetes experts. And the other one is, if you build a platform, it's like building a house. Like he had this analogy, right? Where, if you, and so like, platforms, the way I see it, right? Like you have, and if you follow the reference architectures of like the developer control plane, integration, delivery plane, and so on, but really at the end of the day, you basically have a front end and a back end, like in everything else, right? And so, starting with the front end, starting with the portal, right? It's like you start building a house by putting a door and the windows, when you still don't have anything else, right? It's kind of like that, right? It's not that you don't need the doors and the windows. They're great. They're very important. But if you start from there, you're not going to go far, right? And so I think to answer your question, I think that the important thing is, that you fix problems that you identify in the design phase, and usually those problems are, when it comes to the platform engineering universe, is really around configurations, right? That's where the painful bit for both platform ops teams, whatever, like the operation side of things and the application development side of things is okay, from the app dev perspective, I need to, understand Helm and understand the Terraform and touch all those different things, and I'm scared to mess them up. So like I just copy paste something, and then I run it through ops, which creates all sorts of delays, and it needs to be security vetted, takes a week before it's back, and then I'm just copy pasting every time, so it creates this like massive mushrooming effect on my config files and so on. And on the flip side, my ops team is constantly under pressure because they need to like it's kind of like debug and security vet all these things all the time, and now they have like a growing amount of config files that they need to like maintain, keep updated. If I just want to update one simple database, I need to update 20 different files instead of like one resource definition, and so on and so forth, right? And so that the pain really is in the configuration management bit, both your application and your infrastructure configurations, right? And so that's where I think that's what backends basically take care of, especially orchestration layers. Because again, I think, you have different ways of thinking of a backend. You can just like stitch together your CI, Argo, CD, and like a crossplane or something. That's fine. like that's going to give you the backend, but it's not going to give you, it's not going to automate and standardize all your configurations. That's where you need some sort of an orchestration layer, right? And so I think that's ultimately at least what we want to prove, right? When it comes to platform engineering is, hey, the amount of configuration files that your developers need to deal with goes from like 10 to 1, which is usually a score file. And if you're an ops team and want to update your Postgres from V14 to V15, instead of touching 400 RDS resource definitions, you touch 1, maybe 2, and that's it, right? And that's like real saving, real impact on then your DORA metric, time to market, and so on. But again, you don't need to go so far, because like, how do you prove time to market impact in 4 weeks, right? You just show, hey, like we made everyone's life easier, better in this way.
Yeah, and I think the key to all of that, actually, I want to change that. One of the things that you published recently that I found really helpful in understanding how this all ties together were your reference architectures, and you produced 2, one for AWS and one for GCP, and those were just incredibly helpful for visualizing like all those different components that you just described. Because for me, like, it's one thing to talk about those, but then whenever you turn around and you put your hands on the keyboard and you're ready to start doing something, like how do you take that conceptual stuff and turn it into like, like Terraform resource files or something like that. And so that reference architecture diagrams you produced, I thought did a really great job of helping tie the conceptual stuff to the hands-on stuff.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, a couple of things on that. So one, we released so many at this point. Like we have like GCP, AWS, Azure, multi-cloud, hybrid, OpenShift, on-prem, like everything really, in terms of diagrams, and in terms of actually open source code. We have now GCP, AWS, and Azure all live in on GitHub, and people can just fork that. And I think the thing that's these have been, I think, extremely important, as I was saying earlier, to just kind of level the conversation and like, hey, this is what we're talking about when we talk about an internal developer platform, especially an enterprise grade internal developer platform that usually has that orchestration layer in the middle of it. But it's also been, I think, extremely helpful in, again, like aligning all the different stakeholders within a company to move along, right? And I think the bit that was really missing was this MVP part, right? Mm-hmm. And so now when you combine the reference architectures with the MVP framework, you have something that I think is quite powerful in terms of platform engineering adoption, because you really have an end-to-end stream where from the very kind of like beginning, when you download a white paper or something, or you see it on social, all the way to the final thing that you present to internally before you make a multi-million-dollar decision internally is the same thing. It's just like the same language. And then the MVP is actually how you go from zero or whatever brownfield complex setup you have right now to that reality step by step, right? And again, it's just the MVP also follows effectively the reference architectures. It just focuses on a subset of it and then expands to all of it over time, right? And so I think combining those two things has been very, very helpful in a lot of the conversations that we're having. And I mean, if we're plugging PlatformCon, the two kind of new, so we have like 5 tracks this year: stories, culture, toolbox, which we've always had for the last 2 years, and then impact and blueprints, which we introduced for the first time last year. And I think if you look at the top 15, 20 talks from PlatformCon 23, like 80% are in the latter two. And the reason is quite simple, because if you look at what people care about in the platform engineering community in the Slack, and there's like 18, 19,000 people in there now, it's usually about these two things, right? It's like impact is like, how do I get executive support? How do I speak C-level language to get buy-in from a platform initiative? A lot of people struggling with that. And then, okay, platform engineering is all good and dandy, but like, what does this thing actually look like, right?
Yeah.
And that's the blueprints and the reference architectures are about, right? And so that's really what people are struggling with, is how do I, I'm bought in with platform engineering. That's great. Sounds all great. But like, how do I actually combine the vendor and open source tooling into something that makes sense for my engineering org? And then how do I sell internally? How do I get there? How do I iterate? And that's the MVP, right? And so that's where I think the combination of the two is really the way to go.
I actually want to ask about that maybe. At my company, Authorist, we offer security for platforms. So there's always a weird interaction here where we don't get to see, like, on the other side of the curtain of what our customers are really doing and how they're utilizing things. So we talk about platforms a lot. Like, what sort of platforms are people actually building? I can imagine that there's ones that are massive pluggable systems that allow any number of components put in. But from your experiences, maybe you really see what are people actually hands-on orchestrating here that really has an impact by having a platform engineering team and building up some sort of platform in their cloud account.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we see a lot is, I think again, there the conversation is really, okay, what is the value of a platform team, right? And I think for me, the value is what I call this, like last mile optimization thing, right? Because I think it's a very real conversation to be had because platform engineering is so new, there's, I think, a lot of bias still of kind of like build instead of buy, right? Like, if you go to like an infra team today and say, hey, can you rebuild Kubernetes from scratch? Like nobody would do that, right? But when you say, hey, would you build the orchestration layer in the platform yourself? A lot of people say, yeah, sure, like that makes sense. We're building the platform, we're the platform team, let's do that. And obviously, again, the problem there is like, okay, how much are you reinventing the wheel, and where is your real value? And I think, again, I can speak about platform orchestrators. We've built one for the last 3 years. Speaking with hundreds of customers and so on, it's not easy. You can go and build your own, and maybe there are some rare cases where you should do that, but should you really spend 2 or 3 years doing that? And then people always forget, it's really the maintenance after that is a lot of the pain as well.
For sure. Forgets, I think, maybe not underselling it, like intentionally avoid thinking about, right?
Exactly. Because so many times also it's not their problem, right? It's I would have already left to another company making 30-40% more money. I've learned something, right? And this is also like a conversation that I think is really where it's like really vital to, again, look at those metrics and pain points, because so many times, you have, again, just like perverse incentives where individual contributors will say, oh, well, I'll use the company that the money pays me to go and build something on my own side, learn it, so I can go make more money at the next job instead of actually solving the problems here, right? And so many times this conversation happened in the face of management, just management doesn't even realize it's happening, right? Which is quite crazy and frustrating sometimes for, I think, everybody involved. But yeah, so what was I saying? You guys weren't listening.
Well, I asked about.
I think we got too deep on a few tree branches. But
I think that's where the value really comes in when you dive in rather than just high level stuff. But we were talking about the types of platforms people have to build, how they integrate them, and from the platform templates that you have available.
And so the value is in this last mile optimization, right? That's what I believe, because ultimately there is no Argo CD core contributor or product team at a vendor like Humanitec that will know your engineering organization as well as you do, right? And so your work as a platform team, I think, is to basically take in, you know, this toolbox effectively, which is platform engineering. And it's a combination of open source and vendor tooling, and then you kind of like go build a platform that makes sense. You know, listen to your developers, building it as a product, and so on and so forth. And so that's where where we see different platforms, right? Where I think the bad ones basically try to like build everything from scratch, and end up 2 years later where they still haven't solved any problems, and it's just effectively a bunch of engineers just like playing around for the sake of playing around because they learn new things or whatever. And then there's the good ones where the conversation is like very pragmatic around, okay, what is the right level of abstraction here? What is the right level of context that I want to provide developers? How do I build golden paths and not golden cages? And like all these things, that's where, I think that's really the difference. So you have like, that's where the good platforms are versus the bad platforms. And then of course, within the good platforms, I think there is still this idea of like, progressively understanding what the real pain points are. And I think there is really a question around how mature your organization is, as well as how mature the market is, as well as just how your journey has been, right? Because we've seen platform teams that, for instance, have, been around for a while and have made some mistakes. And so, like all of us, and so, they're much more mature and they understand, hey, I already tried to build like an orchestrator. That's not where my time is best invested. Let me go do something else, right? And then it's a much easier conversation to have than, build versus buy. Like, what do I do? Like, I never tried this. Let me just go spend 2 years and like a couple million euros on this thing because it's not my money anyway.
Yeah, and I think that combined with the MVP approach is what makes this so compelling, because having spent almost my entire career in early stage startups, I want to tell everyone listening to this, your MVP is wrong. I don't care how many times you've done this, your MVP is going to be wrong, which is why it's so important to make it the minimum viable platform so that you can fail fast and figure out why it's wrong and then correct that, which puts you on the path to building the right thing much, much sooner, rather than investing, like you just said, tons of money and years of time to figure out, oh shit, that was wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you were, Will, like mulling over some past trauma there for the last few minutes.
Oh, dude, there's so much trauma there. We can talk about it and then bill this whole thing to my insurance company as therapy.
I was actually advising this one company just even last week where they went through the internal platform themselves. And then you get these dreaded emails where a high-level VP or even executive sends off congratulating this team on releasing the new version of their thing, and wait for it, everyone just has to, and then fill in the blank, right? It's like update all of their whatever, and it's good. And I'm just like, I don't know what do they think? People are just magically getting value out of this for nothing? I mean, it's not great for individual teams when they do this rollout in that way and force them to actually do additional work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like I've seen so many platform initiatives being blocked by developers because they're like, what's in it for me? It's just like you're just solving your problems, or you've decided to play with shiny new tech and not solve my problems. And that's at the end of the thing, right? Like, it's so easy when you enter in the mindset of like, everyone's selfish and you just got to solve their problems, not yours. And as soon as you solve other people's problems, like things start to click actually.
Yeah, but that is totally fair feedback for the developers to say, what's in it for me? Because they are the customers in this case.
Yeah, exactly. Customer's always right.
Yeah. Right. Whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I don't know if I go that far, but there is definitely a huge wisdom there. I mean, I usually try to say that you want to pull innovation from three different areas: your users, your competitors, and your internal team. And I think the problem is when you're only pulling from one of those avenues, you end up in some sort of pitfall.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. And of course, like Casper's always right. In this case, is a bit extreme, right? Because developers are not always right. And you definitely want to have a balanced perspective, right? Like in your triangle, right, would be basically the developers, kind of like the operations team and management, right? Because they all have like not competing interests, hopefully, but like, there is always some level of misalignment. And actually the platform can become a great way of aligning those incentives, right? Because ultimately, management, what they want is time to market. Ops, they just want to be able to play with new tech and not have to like do the same thing over and over again and like readapt the same Helm chart for the 100th time. And developers just want to develop features and don't want to have to worry, don't want to like be scared when they click deploy or have to wait a week when they want to try something new, right? And so it's really this kind of like balancing act between these things. But yeah, I mean, platform engineering done right ultimately fixes exactly those problems.
I hear the lie perpetrated often like, we'll change this and you won't have to do anything whatsoever. You can just focus on developing features. I mean, I look at even functions as a service platforms, and there's still like a little bit that says, like, if I look at Lambda and AWS, right, there's the infrastructure. You get to pick ARM or x86, Intel, right, processing unit, or also the memory usage, right, as well as the execution time, the max execution time before timeout. What's the right interface for engineering teams that are more on the product side, more on the feature UI, front, the end user side? What really should they expect? What's a reasonable compromise here for the things that they should have to know, even with the most perfect platform that could exist?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer is it depends on who they are, right? So, because look, the reality set is a junior front-end engineer will not care whether they're deploying to AKS or OpenShift. In fact, they probably will not care where to deploy, period, right? Whether it's Kubernetes or anything else. They just want to, test, they change to their code or whatever, and that's it. At the same time, a senior backend or whoever on maybe the same team or adjacent team, might be very attached to their YAML configuration files and whatever. And so you need to think like give different paths for different users, and that is why if you look at the reference architecture of the internal developer platforms, you have different possible interfaces in kind of the front end, right? The sort of like the developer control plane. You have portals and kind of like UI heavy stuff, which I think again is important, and it provides a layer of visibility, comes with dashboards and so on. That's where the alignment also with management can come into place, because architects management usually like to see their metrics and whatever. But I think for the vast majority of app devs that I've seen, what they usually like most is something like Score, which is why we release this open source kind of spec, because it's most familiar to what they're used to. It's just a YAML file, but instead of you having to touch like 20 YAML files, now you can just do it through one. Right, and so it abstracts a lot of the complexity, but it still provides you a familiar interface and a familiar workflow. You have your repo, you get pushed with the config file and so on, and off you go. Right, and so I think meeting people where they're at is really important. In general, I would say, because in the vast majority of cases, kind of like YAML file is how you configure things. Like starting with Score first or an equivalent is I think like your best bet as a platform team to get adoption by your developers. But I also think that having that pairing that with some sort of UI is really, really important. The important thing, though, again, is start with the backend first, and then worry about the interfaces. At the same time as you go through the MVP, because it's crucial to get sort of like application developer support from the get-go, really. But again, as we said earlier, right, like think MVP first. So a lot of times you don't actually have to build it out, though. You can just like show them like, hey, here's an example on one application. This is what it's going to look like. Great, right? Like, is this good for you? And a lot of times it's going to be like, oh yeah, this is great. Like, are you telling me like I don't need to touch like 25 YAML files anymore? Yeah, fantastic.
It can really help with those stakeholders or executives who are pounding you to actually get something in or something done the way they want. I remember at a previous company, we were being told that communication between the different sides of our actual platform, product platform, needed to talk to each other more. They needed to have some sort of complex messaging strategy to communicate problems. And everyone was saying, yeah, they need this. And we're like, no, they don't. They never use it. And after a lot of discussions, I'm like, whatever, you know what we're doing? In our UI, we're going to have a button that says, message the other party. And we put a button there. It's a different color, says click me, basically. The button literally did nothing. And if they clicked it, we would get a message that said, hey, someone clicked this button. And like still to this day, I haven't heard that anyone has actually ever clicked this thing. And so we got to avoid a lot of things, but you gave the interface that people expected in a way that made sense. And you also got, I will just like crack it up here. This is the funniest thing he's ever heard.
This is like straight out of the movie Office Space.
Totally. But it's so true that sometimes it's just like that. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just you got to listen. And sometimes it's a compromise, right? That's the thing. Like that's why I always say, like, as a platform team, like a lot of times it feels like it's just like this like soft skills, like product mindset and being a good communicator and being able to basically internal marketing and so on, which is like all the opposite of like hardcore like engineering things.
No one wants to hear that.
Yeah, nobody wants to hear that, exactly. But somebody's got to do it, otherwise you're not going to go far.
No, I've been saying that for the last couple of weeks now because it just like spilled out of my mouth, and I was like, holy crap, that's true. It's that your department's not a cost center, you just suck at marketing. And like this kind of highlights that, how do you get a successful internal development platform? And it really is a marketing effort, and you have to take that early stage startup product mentality and build your MVP and be willing to fail fast and iterate on it, which comes down to, customer feedback and communication.
Yeah, totally.
One of the ideas in this space that I've been toying around with quite a while now is the idea of chargebacks. And I don't know if this helps get teams on the same page, but and just for everyone to understand what this concept is basically, let's say a platform team owns a third-party integration. You buy an auth provider off the shelf, right? You can measure your other team's usage and actually charge them how much some part of the bill or the contract, pass it through so that they get to see what they're utilizing. But it also doesn't make the platform team a huge cost center. But with like a platform that they're building, I keep wondering, would it be even better to be like, hey, before we even hire any engineers, how many engineers of work do you want us to do for you? And have them commit some part of their budget to actually funding that enterprise and use the fact that they're paying in as a justification for the platform being a success.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in general, like the whole budget conversation is super interesting and that's like really the bit where, while the MVP I think can really like be streamlined, across a lot of different types of organizations, like quite easily. The budget, the conversation is always different, right? Sometimes the DevOps people have the budget, sometimes the infra people have the budget, and so like you have to figure out like what makes them click. And also, I think in some cases, what's really interesting is again, not just
the salespeople have the budget, right? You missed that one.
Yeah. Exactly. And you know, you need to understand like not just from a technical perspective, how you know how you sell them the idea and like what are the problems that you're solving for them, but also like culturally, and kind of like also, I mean, I think like from a career perspective, right? Like what's in it for them again, right? So it's like you have an existing infra team. How could this infra team like become part of like your you know, partially become part of your platform engineering effort, while at the same time still doing their infra work, right? Because again, platform engineering is about building the product. It's not about like necessarily maintaining the infrastructure that platform runs on, right? But yeah, like you have certainly this dynamic with like, you know, infra team like feeling threatened by a platform initiative, and so like, you know, how do you provide them a path, an on ramp onto platform engineering, onto the platform initiative? And there's different ways of doing that. And sometimes they're the ones with with a lot of the budget, right? They can actually support your platform team that might have budget as well, but you know, maybe not as much or something like that.
No, I totally agree. It's just, you're 100% there. I mean, we keep on saying that realistically, communication is really important, whether or not you want to hear it or not. You know, selling the idea of it, you know, wherever you're going, right? You know, what's even the point of this whole initiative? You know, and I think a lot of people need to hear that. And I bet there's even more that believe they don't, and that is still like they think they're doing well, and they probably should be doing this even better. But I have to wonder, you know, what if you're in the 1%, or maybe it's even 10% that has iterated this on a lot of times and maybe is even doing a good job today? Like, are there still sorts of things that can help them propel like much further, right? Like, you know, let's say you're on the sort of long tail side of the spectrum. Like, what you know, what aren't they doing that they could be doing so much better than they are now? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, not to go into too much of a kind of like pitch thing here, but like,
no, you should totally do it.
But I think, you know, truly, when, you know, I think like 3 years ago when I was speaking to people, I was like, hey, platform engineering, and it was like, oh, I guess like we have been doing that, but we haven't really called that, you know. And now it's like, oh yeah, no, we're like a platform engineering team, and you know, we do platform engineering, so which I think is fantastic. Like, it's a huge improvement to where we were like just 2 years ago. But then you kind of like dive deeper and you go like, okay, so like, you know, what's the platform that you're building? Like, blah, 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 you know, how do you do this? How do you do that? And again, like, I think like consistently people basically just like stitch together a bunch of like open source stuff. And you know, nothing against open source, but it's just like, again, there's no kind of like really open source enterprise level orchestrator out there yet, at least. And that's one thing that I've constantly see people missing. They're like, oh yeah, you know, I have Terraform, I have Argo, and I have Backstage. So, you know, I'm doing platform engineering. And like, you are, but like, you know, if you want to serve, you know, 1,000 developers and 5,000 developers or whatever, like that combination is just not going to get you really far. And so what you're missing again, like, you know, you could have, like, if you just look at the reference architecture, you have like CI, registry, orchestrator, and, you know, CD, Argo CD, whatever. And then you go into the resource plane. So this is your integration and delivery plane. And so you could just not have the orchestrator. Like, that's fine. It's not like that works. It's just that you're still in a place where, okay, now you have like a Preta UI or whatever. You have a Backstage that took you 6 months to implement, and then you have, you know, a combination of like Argo and Crossplane or whatever in the back end. Developers still need to understand all your configurations end to end, basically, because like all they can pick in the UI is effectively like a service template. And maybe like a workflow template, but you still need to go and like mess with every single, like, you know, Helm chart, Terraform file, whatever underneath that. And you still have a problem from the operations perspective to maintain all of that. And that's not really scalable, right? And so that's what a lot of, I think, like, you know, platform teams are facing right now. And so I think some sort of orchestration needs to be the answer there. I've also certainly seen teams, like very advanced teams that have built their own orchestration. But is really, we're talking about the top 0.001%, like, like the very large sort of like, I mean, I was talking the other day to this, like probably the largest tech company in South America. And they have like an amazing sort of, own orchestration and everything that they built. That's really cool. But I mean, I think they have a platform team of like over 1,000 people. Right. So like, it takes a lot of resources. Yeah. And they're serving something like 15,000 developers, 16,000 developers. So like massive scale. Wow. And at that massive scale, usually you kind of build everything anyways. Right. Like that makes sense. I think my point on the sort of like buy and build or the last mile optimization for platform teams is really like, I think it's kind of like on the tail ends actually, right? So like if you're very small, you just go for a pass and just forget about it, whatever. Like you're running like a small e-commerce, you're like 5 developers, like you don't need to actually do platform engineering. And on the massive, like really like Google scale, almost like Shopify, Spotify, Airbnb, whatever, like those are the extremes. And also frankly, where you have kind of like an engineering DNA, right? These are like actual tech companies, not like large enterprises that turn into tech companies. Mm-hmm. But everyone in between is kind of like, well, what's your actual business? Like, are you building infrastructure, or are you, a pharma, or are you building cars, right? And then from there, it's like, okay, like, the crazy thing we've seen in the last 10 years, 20 years is like, even Amazon, right? Like Amazon, when they launched AWS, I think it was like 500 developers, something like that. Like, I don't know how many like tens of thousands they have right now, right? Like, and that's happened like across the board, right? Like an automotive manufacturer had like one outsourced something somewhere, and maybe like 20 people in house, and now they have like 5,000 people in house, right? Like it was like crazy explosion, and you really need to think hard, and I think like one problem, to go a little bit esoteric, is that we have. I think in an industry, right? If you think about it, it's incentives again, in an industry where there was a huge demand for engineering headcount and massive undersupply, like you end up in a place where engineers, developers, like kind of like, hey, we're the prima donna, we decide what we want to do, blah blah blah, and you end up in this like very dysfunctional situations where again it's like, oh, it's I'm going to do this because it's good for my career and I learn, where like in no other like business unit of a company this would ever fucking fly, right? Like never. But it's just like there's a lot of entitlement, and I think like there is a progressive commoditization of a lot of this industry that will, I think, like converge to a more rational like local optimum, because I think right now sometimes you just see things that frankly just don't really make sense.
I think you're 100% right there in a lot of ways. I'd even push one of the extreme sides of the spectrum even further. Like I think even companies like Google and Amazon, you mentioned Airbnb, like unless it's your core competency of what you're doing, it's not even worth it to optimize in that way, because I've heard it so many times, our problems are too big to not have our own solution for that. But I mean, at some point you are no longer the best at that thing because it's not your core competency. You really don't care. It doesn't need to be differentiated. And then you get into a huge problem there. And so honestly, there's very few things that even at massive scale you can't somehow farm out in a good way. And I like this example where AWS is using Firecracker for their Lambdas, right? It's an open source solution. So no one can go around and say, hey, we can't use a solution we found off a shelf, because it is literally on the shelf that you can go and go and pull it. So, I mean, anyone could have built that. It didn't have to be AWS. That just so happens to be what they're using. And I would be a little bit concerned if any of the other giant function as a service providers weren't using Firecracker, given the number of security challenges that are included with container escape. And I think that's the biggest one, right? It's not your core competency to write an orchestrator. So like unless you're getting like a huge amount of business value, or literally you are Humanitec, right? Like you shouldn't be doing that. Like, you know, if you think you need that, I would just go and find the experts in the area.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's just like, you know, this doesn't happen in sales teams. Like people don't try and build their Salesforce instance. Obviously, it happens because we're engineers, right? And people kind of have this like sort of like inclination towards that. And I think when you combine that with a new space like platform engineering, where there's no like clear like established, okay, how far can you push this and what's okay, what's not okay, then you end up in some weird extremes. But yeah, as the space matures, I think you can see like more. You know, I was just at KubeCon in Paris last week, and I mean, you know, like 3 years ago, I basically had to explain to everybody what platform engineering was. And you know, last year everybody knew what it was, but they still like didn't really understand like, you know, deeper concepts like orchestration and so on. This year, I literally had like half of the people that I spoke to were like, oh yeah, like we do platform engineering since 3 years. We know exactly like this and this and this is happening. We need a platform orchestrator. Like, you know, it's just like, or they can frame their pain points and the thing that they thinking about in such an accurate way is quite stunning. Actually, it's crazy. I mean, I think it just speaks to the compounding of the trend. I mean, also like PlatformCon, right? Like we did it for the first time in 22, 6,000 people. Last year, 22,000 people. This year, expecting 35,000 people. Like you just see that like compounding year over year is crazy. And so I think we're getting there. But yeah, there's certainly still some kind of like weird asymptotes happening here and there, which is why I think it's so important to have standards, right? And maybe not end up in, you know, a place where, you know, I don't know, like, you know, what is GitOps? It's like everybody has their own definition, and it's kind of like it's blurry, and ideally, like platform engineering ends up in a bit of a more defined place with like more, you know, clear standards, clear concepts, and how they all interact with each other.
Well, people can't even decide on what the definition of DevOps is. Like, I still see titles out there that say, you know, they're hiring a DevOps engineer, and I'm just like, you don't understand what that means, because like if you look at the official definition, like where it came from, where the concept really originated, it's about eliminating this separation. And so between operations and developers, and to say that there's just a role. I mean, so a lot of companies have just rebranded their release engineering team, called them DevOps team. I'm a DevOps engineer, and just is like, and so now we need a new word to really define the whole movement all over again.
So now they're rebranding to platform teams, right?
It's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. But you did point out something there that I want to highlight, Luca, for people listening that are resistant to change because they're concerned about how it's going to impact their career. You know, there's some people that they study and they work hard and they get their job in tech and they want to preserve that. And so they hear about things like, you know, like DevOps or platform engineering, and they're concerned that that's going to eliminate their position, but that's actually not the case. Many times what it does is it can be used to solve the parts of your job that are overwhelming to you, to give you the time and the flexibility to do new things, because most of us in this industry are just geeks by heart, and we like using technology to solve problems. And so a big part of using these tools is to solve the parts of your job that you don't like, to give you the freedom and the capacity to solve the problems that are entertaining to you, when those problems actually line up to be beneficial for the business that you're working for.
Amen.
Yeah, you got it. But I mean, if it's solving the parts of the problem that you actually do care about solving and doing, then you can go join the company or the team that's actually automating that, right? There's no work that's going away. It's just transitioning or being formed. It's not like you necessarily have to learn new things or anything like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. But yeah, which is why I think like the conversation around like how do you get people on board with this and not make them feel threatened is very real and very important. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of times I just point people to their backlog. Like, look at your backlog. You're not going anywhere.
Yeah. And this is why, like, I mean, we've had the whole like controversy of like DevOps is dead and so on. And again, like we like pissing people off, I guess. But
I was gonna say you're the originator of that meme. So
but that I think made people listen, right? Same thing like we had on the booth, like platform engineering does it for weeks. Like 3 years ago when we had on our booth like DevOps is dead, like you have all this like concerned DevOps engineers walking up and like, hey, why is DevOps dead? I'm not dead. I'm certainly alive. Blah blah. And like I kid you not, every single one walked out with that T-shirt and we hugged it out, every single one of them, because of course that is like a big statement and it's wrong. Actually, it's a wrong statement, but it gets the conversation started, which is the important part, and then. We have the conversation. Then, same thing with platform engineers. Like now, like nobody used to call themselves platform engineers 3 years ago. Now you had, platform engineer does it for weeks. All these concerned platform engineers walked up to us and were like, hey, I'm a platform engineer. What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And they agreed with the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, like it's true. Like if you don't have some MVP approach to this, like you're completely, kind of like doomed to fail. But I think the interesting thing there is like, if you think about what platform engineering does, it actually enables DevOps. It actually enables true, you build it, you run it at enterprise scale in the cloud native era, right? Because I mean, if you're like, 10 people, 15 people, and everybody knows you're kind of like a Helm chart, staring from files and so on, it's great. Like you can actually do DevOps. It's just like when you're onboarding like, 50 new people a month, to an increasingly complex cloud native setup, like forget about it, right? And so that's I think that's the interesting kind of like evolution going back to the Romanian thing of DevOps into platform engineer.
Sweet. Well, that's been a good chat. Should we move on to some picks?
Let's move on to the picks.
All right, cool. Warren, I'm picking on you this week. What'd you bring?
Yeah. So I'm bringing Spring. So I didn't say Spring.
Wait, Java Spring?
No.
Okay.
For the love of God, definitely not. No, the season.
I was about ready to boot you out of the show.
Yeah, no. I only used Java for 4 weeks of my entire life at the first year of the university. And that was the beginning and end, and I will never do it again. No, I'm the season, and I think it's really important because I think it spells new things coming and waves of change. And the reason that I'm bringing it up this week is because I was reminded, because in Switzerland, what happens when spring gets here, not by the clock or by the solstice, or equinox, what actually happens is that you smell cow manure everywhere for one day. So you're walking down the street and it's like, well, I guess it's spring now because you can smell it.
I forgot you two are actually relatively close to each other, at least from where I am, because you're in Switzerland and Luca, you're in Italy, right?
Yeah. Where in Switzerland are you, Warren?
I mean, that's such like being an American from the U.S. thing is like, that's such an American thing to say. Hey, you're both in Europe. You must be close to each other,
right? Yeah, that's what like.
But we're actually.
I've seen it on the map. It's a little bitty place.
Yeah, no, for sure. Actually, Italy is one of the 4 countries that borders Switzerland. So.
And I'm in Milan, which is like actually close. We're like an hour away from Switzerland. So.
Yeah, I'm right outside Zurich.
Okay.
All right, cool. Luca, what'd you bring for a pick?
Well, so I was actually thinking about something else at the beginning. I was going to say Alan Watts. Are you guys familiar with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Alan Watts, like really, really interesting thinker. There is all these kind of like, he was like the first one to bring all the sort of like Eastern philosophies to the West in the 60s, 70s. And they recently, I don't know if it recently, but like they basically digitized all this like, so Sam Harris, this like other guy, right? Like he basically digitized all this like cassettes from the 80s, from the 70s, 80s into this like super long like thing that you can listen to now. I mean, it's on the Waking Up app, but I think this is probably on YouTube as well. Like, there's definitely a lot of stuff on YouTube as well. And I think like this guy's so fascinating because you listen to him and it's like an hour long where he goes no notes. Like there's no notes, and it's just like a constant stream of incredible, like interesting perspectives on different things. I thought that was really impressive. But then when you were talking about the whole Darwinian thing, I actually thought about like a book that I've been rereading, which is at the Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. And I mean, this thing, I just cannot recommend it more. And it really goes to also kind of the entire, I mean, you know, he talks about like how basically it's a fusion between epistemology, which is kind of the how is knowledge created, right? Like is the science of knowledge really? And I mean, he's a father of quantum computing. So you have like computing, you have physics, you have and he sort of like condenses it in a bunch of very interesting points of view, such as, you know, and I thought about it earlier because of what you were saying, Oren, which is, you know, knowledge effectively, as far as we know, you know, in the universe gets created only by biology in the shape of evolution, right? And this is like this like random variation and then selection. And that creates, you know, knowledge that is stored in DNA and then like effectively applied through RNA, yada, yada, yada. And then the only other way of building knowledge that we know of is, you know, is humans, which puts, I think his entire chapter is called optimism, that kind of like, you know, frames, you know, because there's a lot of people that have this concept of like, you know, what Stephen Hawking said, which is, you know, we're just like a very average, you know, chemical scum on some average planet orbiting some average stars, you know, average galaxy, blah, blah. And actually he kind of goes like, not really, you know, and that's, I think it's quite cool.
I mean, there's like an extension there. Yeah. That's fine. You can have three if you want, if you've got a third one.
Yeah. There's no limit.
No, I'll stop it.
There's no quota. So it's funny. I'm actually changing my pick too, because originally I was going to pick this book, Managing Your Mind, the Mental Fitness Guide. Like you can see, if you're not listening to the podcast and you're actually watching on YouTube, you can see how worn out this book is because I've read it so many times. It's just such a great book for dealing with all of the things you have to deal with in life and learning to prioritize and manage those without feeling overwhelmed. Like it's just such a great book. But changing my pick, since I sort of pseudo-picked that one anyway, because of the conversation we had here, very similar book to what you just picked, Luca, Brian Greene, Until the End of Time. Brian Greene is an astrophysicist, and this book goes through like the history of the universe as we understand it, from, you know, the Big Bang to what's they estimate will be the end of our universe. But the reason I like this is because his ability to explain it and put it into terms that you can understand and relate it to things that you see every day is just really, really well done. Like his ability to communicate is great. And so it's worth that for a couple of reasons. One, because it's an entertaining read to think about the space that we live in. But there's also like a secondary lesson there of learning how he communicates and applying that to our roles as engineers, you know, whenever we're talking about Kubernetes and Helm and, you know, Perl and Go or whatever else, and trying to translate that into a level that's appropriate for the audience that you're speaking to, so you can sell your idea of adopting platform engineering when you're getting support for your MVP. So
yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
My pick.
It's really great point there. I mean, he also wrote Elegant Universe, I believe, which was also a really, really good book on the topic of just physics in general.
Right on. Yeah, I haven't read that one.
I mean, yeah, he definitely able to distill it down so that anyone can understand it. And I feel like there's nothing that bothers me more, even coming from an engineering background, when I just hear a lot of engineering words and I'm like, those don't really mean anything to most people.
Right. Yeah. Sounds really cool, but that's not a complete sentence, bro. Awesome. Luca, thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed the conversation, very helpful, and looking forward to PlatformCon this year. That's in early June, right?
Yeah, 10th to 14th of June. We actually made it a full week this year. It used to be just 2 days, but there's just two. Last time I think we had like 180 talks. It was 90 talks per day. Is way too many talks. So we kept it back down at like 90 or 100, and we spread them across the entire week, which I think, will be fun. And we also have the first in-person actually sort of like live day. So we have a bunch of satellites and kind of like watch parties all over the world, but there's also going to be a proper live day in London on the Wednesday, I believe, the 12th, if people want to join us in person.
Right on.
It's free.
Yeah. 5 days of platform engineering, 5 full tracks, and all completely free. So definitely worth checking out. But again, thank you for being on the show. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, same
Warren,
here. Thank you for having me, guys. Anytime.
Yeah. Warren, thank you again.
Yeah, of course.
Love having you on as co-host. All the listeners, thank you all for listening. Be sure and reach out and let us know if there's anything you want, any guests that you want to hear, questions you want to ask. Oh, speaking of questions, I am doing a live Q&A session with some of the speakers from PlatformCon at the end of the conference. So if you have questions you want me to ask them, be sure and let me know that. And with that said, I'll see everyone next week.